Today, I'm going to cover motivation and what it is and why it matters for exercise. In 2016, one of my colleagues, Ryan Rhodes, and also one of my dissertation committee members from Brown University, David Williams, did a study with the goal of disentangling an individual's actual physical capabilities from their motivation. The study, which was published in Psychology, Health, and Medicine, asked the participants if, over the next 2 weeks, they could strength train for 2 bouts per week, and I think it was for about 20 minutes. And all of the participants responded on a 5 point scale, basically where 0 represented definitely cannot do, and 100 representing definitely can do. So 5 point scale, but it was rated at 0 to 100. So you can imagine 20% increments, with 1 being slightly, I believe I can do this, all the way up to 100, where they say, I definitely can do this. Then, after all of the participants read or completed the script, they read 2 vignettes. So vignettes are just short stories. The first vignette said this. It said, Ben is lifting weights with his friend Kevin. Kevin loads several weights onto the barbell. Ben tells Kevin that he can't lift that much weight. Although he agrees to try, despite his best efforts, Ben cannot lift the bar. Then the next story said, Jeremy is experiencing loneliness during his first semester at college. He seeks counseling at the Student Counseling Center. The counselor suggests that Jeremy ask a female classmate out for coffee. Jeremy says he can't ask out his female classmate. The counselor points out that, in fact, Jeremy can ask his classmate out for coffee, but he's afraid of being rejected. Jeremy agrees with the counselor that he can ask his classmate out for coffee. He is just afraid. So this was really saying, what can you actually do versus are there other things that make it difficult to do that behavior? Now, after reading those vignettes, participants were instructed to consider the words can and cannot as they were used by Ben in story 1 and by the counselor in story 2. Once participants understood the difference between can and cannot, their ratings of capability to do strength training went up. So this was perceived capability. This was an interesting study which points to the fact that most people can exercise. That is, they are capable of exercising, but for any number of reasons, they're more motivated to do other things, or maybe they're not motivated to exercise. So what is motivation? The first definition, I just looked this up online. It said that motivation is the reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. But I wasn't sure if that was a great definition. I wasn't sure if it clicked with me and my understanding of motivation and exercise, because that definition feels more like a motive or why somebody would exercise. Researcher Susan Michie, who we'll discuss later, defines motivation as all the brain processes that drive and energize behavior. She defines motivation as referring to conscious and unconscious cognitive processes that direct and inspire behavior. Now, it's important to note that motivation is the prime driver of behavior. You might have heard something like this. You might have heard people saying, don't rely on motivation for exercise, or do it even when you're not motivated. But I think this is wrong. But at the same time, I understand the messaging, and it's not like it's bad messaging. It's just not a great understanding of what motivation is. This is because you can't do anything without motivation, or you won't do anything without motivation. Anytime you do something, there has to be some level of motivation. This is because motivation is actually a huge umbrella term. And I think once we discuss motivation, you'll have a better understanding of what it is and why it's vital for behavior change and behavior maintenance. Now, you'll learn that there are different types of motivational qualities, some that get us going with exercise, and other types of motivational quality that guarantee that we continue exercise. But at first, it might be easier to say what the other determinants of behavior are. That way we can establish what is not motivation. So Susan Michie, who I just mentioned, she's a quite prolific British psychologist out of the University College at London. She's done a lot of research on health behavior change. One of her models, it's called the COMB or COMB. It's not COMB, it's COMB. So the COMB model for behavior change cites capability, opportunity, and motivation as 3 key factors for behavior, that's the B, to occur. So capability C, opportunity O, motivation M, behavior B, COMB. So capability is a person's psychological and physical capability to participate in an activity. It's your physical skills, your knowledge, your ability to self-regulate, meaning planning or resisting other temptations. In the first example that I gave in that with the vignettes, where the student was not able to bench press a certain weight. This was because it was too heavy. This would be a physical capability issue. I might be really motivated to lift this weight, but if I can't physically do it, that's a physical capability issue. Opportunity is going to refer to external factors that make a behavior possible. That might mean having a gym membership or being prompted to exercise. Now, let's just break all these down. So let's say that you wanted to ride a bike, for example, but didn't know how to ride a bike. That's a capability issue, specifically a skill issue, or what we would call a physical capability issue. Next, let's say that you wanted to ride a bike but did not have a bike. That's an opportunity issue. Both capability and opportunity do affect motivation. For example, I wouldn't be that motivated to ride a bike if I didn't know how to ride a bike or if I didn't have a bike. So I initially said that motivation, that initial definition that I found, was defined as the reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. But in research, motivation is often measured as a person's intention to do physical activity. Intention strength is an indication of how much effort a person is willing to exert to engage in a behavior. And research participants are often asked if they intend to be physically active, which is really a way to dichotomize motivation as being present for a certain behavior or not present. But intention is also measured in terms of magnitude. Someone might be asked on a scale of 0 to 10, the extent to which they're motivated to be physically active, with 0 meaning no intention or really low motivation or amotivation, and 10 meaning an extremely strong level of intention or very high motivation. But when intention is dichotomized, so I have an intention or I don't, people are often lumped into 4 different categories. So this is people, the first category is people that have no intention to be active and then are subsequently active. But this is very rare. Only about 2% of people fall into this category. Or it might be better just to say only at 2% of the time are people without an intention, are they also subsequently active. So basically this means that having an intention to be active is what we would call a prerequisite to being active in most cases. That's just because if you don't have an intention, you're probably not going to be active. Now, the next is people that have no intention to be active and aren't active. That means I don't intend to exercise and then I don't. Then there are people that intend to be active but aren't. So I intend to be active, I want to be physically active, but I'm not. This is extremely common. This is actually where the discordance between an individual's intention and behavior comes into play, the disconnect between my intentions and my behavior. And the last category is people who intend to be active and then are. So these are people that are called successful intenders. On average, people act on their intention to be active or to exercise about half the time. Physical activity research has consistently shown that a person's intention to be active is also associated with engaging in that behavior. This is, like I said before, this is likely the case because it's rare for a person to be active without intending to be. So that's that 2% category. But also having an intention does not guarantee that the person will be active. This is what's called in research the intention behavior gap, and it's quite prevalent in physical activity. So lots of people want to be active, but don't necessarily follow through on their intention. So how does motivation actually work? When I taught a health behavior change class at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, I would ask students to put their hands in the air as high as they could, and most put their hands up about this high, like halfway in the air. Then I would say, if you can put your hand in the air higher, I'll add 10 points to your midterm. So hands would always go higher. Then I would say, if you can put your hand higher, I'll give you an A in the class. And inevitably, someone would end up standing up on their desk with their hand all the way in the air. And then unfortunately, I would have to break it to them that I wasn't actually going to give them an A in the class. But I think I did a demonstration of how some things can change motivation. So in this case, I gave students a motive that was appealing, which was higher grades, and then their behavior subsequently changed. So motivation changed and then behavior changed. This also deals with the next aspect of motivation, which is the actual motive, or you can think of this as the reason why you're exercising. We'll move into this is called self-determination theory. So self-determination theory is a motivational theory developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. They're out in Rochester. It's the University of Rochester. So this theory, self-determination theory, does deal with motives. So first, motives can be grouped as either extrinsic or intrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is doing an activity for its inherent satisfaction. rather than for some separable consequence. So it's only when you're doing this for out of just enjoyment. Extrinsic motivation is when there is any separate outcome that the activity produces. These motives are further broken down as being what's called controlled or autonomous. Autonomous goals reflect personal interest and values, versus controlled goals reflect basically something one feels compelled to do by an external pressure, or even internal pressures. Could be coercion or guilt. Or even if I said I'd give you $100 to exercise and you did it, that's some kind of coercion. So these types of goals are then broken down into the following. So the first is what's called external regulation. So this would be when someone feels compelled to exercise because they are told to or forced to. Maybe a doctor says you need to exercise to lower your blood sugar, or maybe a significant other tells you need to exercise. Like I said before, if I paid you $1,000 to run 5 miles, this would be a type of external regulation. This is within the category of controlled motivation. The next is introjected regulation, which is still controlled motivation. This is when a person exercises because they feel guilty if they don't do it. So maybe I'm not exercising, and for whatever reason I feel guilty about not doing it, and that drives me to exercise. Again, this is still controlled motivation. The next is moving into more autonomous forms of motivation. Identified regulation is when someone has identified with the importance of a behavior. For example, if I value the health outcomes of exercise and do it for that reason. It's still extrinsic, but it's autonomous. I'm doing it for an outcome that I value. It's personally valuable to me. The next is integrated regulation. This is when a person values exercise and it's a part of their identity, meaning it's integrated into who they are. This is the highest form of autonomous motivation, which is also still extrinsic. Then the last is intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, again, is just when a person's exercising because they love it or they enjoy it. Now, a person can hold both controlled and autonomous motives. For example, I might strength train because I want to look good, which is controlled. Appearance motives are controlled types of motivation. I might also exercise because I value the health outcomes and because it's part of who I am and because I enjoy it. A person who has autonomous motives is more likely to persist than a person who just has controlled motives. Now, people don't typically start exercising with autonomous motives, maybe with the exception of valuing their health or connecting exercise to that. So I know I should exercise because it's good for my health. Having exercise integrated into your identity, meaning it's a part of who you are, is the strongest form of autonomous but non-intrinsic motivation. But it takes a long time to integrate a behavior into who you are, into your identity. We'll talk a lot more about this identity construct later because I think it's really vital for exercise maintenance. And I've studied this in regards to resistance training participation. So identity, again, the self-categorization in this case of oneself into the profile of a regular resistance trainer, can distinguish between unsuccessful and successful resistance training intenders. Identity is also important because people who categorize themselves as an exerciser, they still exercise even in the face of disruptions. This is shown by one of my collaborators who I mentioned earlier, Ryan Rhodes. He found that people who had resistance training as part of their identity did not break their resistance training routine even when COVID-19 broke out and gyms closed. Rather, they sought out alternative methods to continue training. And this is why I think identity is much more important for exercise than other constructs like habit. Now, despite all the hype that habits get, it's actually in the title of my new book, Health Habits for Diabetes, shameless plug in the bio. But habits break when a disruption happens. This is because what a habit is a habit is just repeated behavior in a stable context. For example, if I have a habit of doing strength training, I might not go and do it if I'm away for a business trip because my context changed. But if it's strongly integrated into my identity, I'll probably find ways to exercise. In this case, maybe I look for a hotel gym or maybe a body weight routine in my room. But we'll discuss this later and we'll move back to controlled and autonomous motivation. People become more autonomously motivated when they feel choice over the behavior that they do. They're doing it because they want to do it. Also, when they feel competent and when they feel connected to other people revolving around exercise. People feel less autonomous motivation or more controlled motivation when they feel compelled to do the behavior by outside sources, don't feel support, and don't feel competent. So I used to see this in college athletics where students would come in, they'd want to play their sport because they love their sport, but then maybe they don't feel supported by their coach, or maybe they feel like they're forced to do things that they don't want to do, and they end up losing that love for the game. So this is actually where a coach is vitally important to promoting autonomous motivation. It's certain that we don't want to take people that are autonomously motivated to exercise or play a sport and push them towards more types of controlled motivation. So this is that basically motives, so your reason why you're doing something influences your motivation or the magnitude of your motivation. So if I'm autonomously motivated, my general motivational strength will be higher and it will stay consistent. For example, if I go back to those college athletes, if they didn't have a coach telling them that they needed to be here at that time, they probably wouldn't be playing their sport. Definitely not in that context. So motivational quality matters. It might not be as important for starting a change effort, but it's important for maintaining an effort. For example, I might start exercising because my doctor told me to, but if this is my only motive, I probably won't continue with exercise. I might start, but I won't continue. And it's extremely important to make sure that you continue because health benefits take quite a while to accrue. It takes a while to see reductions in blood pressure, improvements in cholesterol profiles, reductions in HbA1c or resting or fasting blood glucose levels. We can dig a little bit deeper into motivation. I said basically there's controlled and autonomous forms of motivation, but another way to think about it is there's a reflective component to motivation, and there's also an automatic component to motivation. Now, reflective components deal with goal setting, decision making, and planning. It's pretty deliberate and analytical, versus the automatic component involves habit. So again, didn't mean to bash on habit earlier. It is important, but also identity, impulses, and then your emotions. How do you imagine exercise would feel? And how, basically, if I think exercise is not going to feel good, that would be an emotional response, and I'd be less likely to do it. Now, here's another way to think about it. It's from a great book called Switch by Dan and Chip Heath. And the authors use an analogy from an NYU psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. They say that the brain has two sides. One is the emotional side, the other is the rational side. In this metaphor, the emotional side, think of it as an elephant, and think of a rational side as a rider, so a rider on top of an elephant. The rider of the elephant looks like he or she is in charge, but when there's a disagreement between the elephant and the rider, the elephant usually wins, the emotional brain. Dan and Chip Heath also include the path. So that is the rider is on the elephant, and the path represents the external environment. We can also think about this as the level of challenge of the task. For example, I might think strength training 5 times per week is a good idea, but I'm not currently doing it at all. My elephant or my emotional brain is going to think that this is too daunting. So no matter how badly my rational brain says I should be doing this, if it feels too daunting, I'm probably not going to be consistent. Also, if I plan on strength training 2 times per week, which is more reasonable if I'm currently not doing any of it and don't have easy access to equipment or a gym, that path still remains daunting, and thus the emotional side of my brain will probably win out. So what can we do when it comes to motivation? So here's what I recommend. The first thing that I recommend is to always have a prompt to exercise. For most people, this just means putting exercise into your calendar. Once the prompt arises, hopefully there's a seamless transition from the prompt to exercise, but this isn't always the case. So what we need to do is match the demand of the task to your motivation. Meaning this, imagine you have 2 dials, a motivation dial and a task difficulty dial. Motivation is context dependent to some extent. So imagine if I'm tired or very busy, my motivational dial goes down. Now, if I mentally keep my challenging task dial at the same level, so if my motivation dial goes down and I don't do anything to the challenge of the task dial, I'm probably not going to exercise. So our options are to find ways to turn the motivational dial up or turn the task demand dial down. It's important to match your level of motivation to the appropriate level of the challenge. For example, in my book, again, Health Habits for Diabetes, another shameless plug, I talk about taking my dog out for a walk, who's sitting right beneath me right now. So when Scout needs to go outside, the extent of my behavior is going to be reflective of my motivation. So he'll prompt me saying, I need to go to the bathroom. If I'm feeling unmotivated, maybe I'll just walk him around the block. If I'm feeling really motivated, there's a 2-mile loop in downtown Boston. He likes it. He can go off of his leash. So I might take him and do that. So if we move this metaphor over to the gym, if I'm not feeling motivated, instead of skipping, maybe I just go for 15 minutes versus going for an hour. Repeating the behavior is going to be vitally important regardless of the intensity you are using to build a routine. And then eventually incorporating this behavior into your identity. I always stress people that they should focus on consistency before they focus on intensity. This is why it's okay to make the task demand smaller, okay? And this technique is what I would call shrinking the challenge. Again, it's equivalent to turning down the task demand dial. This is when we change the behavior in response to the motivation that we have. The other thing that you can do is I call it growing yourself, meaning we can increase our motivation or we can turn our motivation dial up. So our two tactics are really to shrink the challenge, so turn down the challenge dial, or grow yourself, turn up the motivation dial. So how can we increase our own motivation to exercise? I wrote about some techniques that you can use to enhance motivation in Psychology Today, and I'll link the article in the notes below this video. Let's use examples to increase your motivation from harnessing what I call your sources of influence. I'll cover two. The first source of influence is going to be your cognitions or your own thoughts. So in this case, you'll basically be using your own mind to boost your motivation. So how can you do this? This might include reminding yourself of why exercise is important. And there are several routes for this. First, we can connect it to the health outcomes of exercise. But this might, I'm exercising because I want X, Y, and Z in terms of health benefits. Although this might be the weakest way to boost motivation, it might be better to connect it to something more emotional. Thinking about health benefits is a rather rational long-term process. So can we connect it to something that's more emotional? Or in other words, get the elephant going on our side. For example, a lot of people want to exercise. They actually enjoy doing it, but it's hard to build up the momentum. In this case, remind yourself of how good you'll feel about doing exercise. Then think about how you'll celebrate your win. So how will you celebrate after you complete your exercise session? The next thing to do is to connect exercise to things that you value. For example, maybe you value feeling strong and know that strength training is a method to get you there. Outside of cognition, so changing the way we think, you can make exercise more appealing by using a technique called temptation bundling. This technique was made popular by UPenn researcher Katie Milkman. It's when you pair a want with something that you need to do. So in 2020, Milkman and her group published a study in organizational behavior and human decision-making. And what these researchers found was that by giving participants audiobooks or engaging audiobooks and encouraging temptation bundling, meaning they could only listen to their audiobook when they exercise, this boosted their likelihood of a weekly workout by about 10 to 14%. Another technique that we can use is what is called as a starter step. I believe this is from behavioral researcher BJ Fogg, who's out at Stanford. So I don't want to take credit for the name, but I use this technique a lot. And it's almost a fake way of turning down the task challenge dial. In this case, you think of the first thing you need to do to start exercising and only mentally focus on that. For example, rather than worrying about going to the gym for 45 minutes, just tell yourself all you need to do is put on your exercise clothes and get in the car. So we just break down all these steps and only focus on achieving the first step. If you put on your exercise clothes and get in the car, you're probably going to go to the gym. It's just the initial momentum of making that movement to the gym can be a little bit challenging. Or if you're just working out in your home, maybe say, I just need to put on my workout clothes and walk into my exercise room. Or if you're doing aerobics, maybe you think, all I need to do is sit down on my Peloton bike. That's all I need to do. The next level of influence that we can harness is social support. This is a great way to offload motivation. Imagine that you and also a friend planned to work out, and maybe you weren't feeling that motivated, but your commitment to your friend can override these lower levels of motivation. Signing up for a class in advance is another great way to pre-commit to exercise that does typically involve a social component. For example, right now, if I was feeling very motivated to exercise, maybe I sign up for a spin class at 5 p.m., knowing that usually after work I'm feeling less motivated, but I can offload that, or I can basically take the motivation that I have right now and move it forward in time. If I sign up for a class, especially if I put down money to do the class, I'm probably going to go to the class. Now let's recap. So motives are why we want to exercise, and motives largely dictate the intensity of the motivation that we feel. Controlled motives, which include guilt and coercion, are going to be associated with lower levels of motivation and lower likelihood of longer term adherence. Autonomous motivation, which is connected to when we value the outcome, consider exercise to be a part of who we are, part of our identity. Or if we find exercise fun and enjoyable, is going to be associated with long-term adherence. Autonomous motivation takes a little while to build up and only happens if exercise becomes a routine. So I always encourage people, rather than miss a session of exercise and break the routine, we ensure that one, we always have a prompt, schedule exercise with yourself, make it like any other appointment. And when the prompt comes in, if we need to, we can either adjust our motivation dial by cranking it up, turn up the motivation dial with some of the techniques that I just mentioned, or we can make the task easier by turning down the task demand dial.